All right, let's get started. So Julia, you brought up a really cool topic in the comments for the event, something that you've been kind of, it sounds like, encouraging clients, but struggling to get buy-in, and even kind of how to execute on this concept of belonging and bringing that into your messaging, into your brand strategy. So it'd be great if you could start by just kind of sharing where that came from and we can riff on it.
Totally. And I'm so sorry, everyone, that I'm off camera and things are a little chaotic here. I'm at a family reunion in New Jersey and I have escaped with my parents' car and I'm like in a parking lot right now. But so I do a lot of things professionally, but this circumstance came up where I was working with two separate clients, and my main one right now is my more, that's where this question came from, because we're trying to solidify their branding. They brought me on to help their team and their staff, and like their leadership team and their staff, and then of course eventually their membership and their community cohere around a mission and how to communicate that mission, right? This is, I think, what we all think of as branding and social impact, social impact branding, cohering around what are we here to do? What is the message? How do we convey it? And it's a community institution. Their mission is around helping people get outside and experience the outdoors and experience a sense of community. When I brought up, okay, well, this seems like belonging is a really important part of our brand pillars. I do a brand development methodology that I've developed myself, and I develop brand pillars. And they were really resistant to that because they were like, well, we can't guarantee it. And it's kind of presumptuous, like these are my words, I'm paraphrasing, but, the way I work is I really listen to my clients and I try to glean like what are they really saying from this. So I didn't push back, but I really internally I'm like, no, this is an essential thing that we want to communicate, especially with coalition building institutions. And then my other client is actually who resisted that kind of you belong, or there's this, you're going to belong in this room, is a therapist. She's a trauma-informed therapist who works with attachment theory, and she works in an anti-oppressive social justice-based framework. And she also said that feels like bypassy. So that's where this came from. And I really would love to hear about, because this is my primary work. No, thank you. Thanks. So I would love to hear about, do others encounter this? As a history, I've also done trauma-informed yoga work and justice work. So I would love to hear others' perspective. Have you encountered this? How do we talk about this in a way that's not presumptuous? Also, as a white-bodied person, I want to be really, really careful and thoughtful around this. So thanks for letting me share that. And I'm so excited to hear what you all think. Thank you.
Thanks, Julia. Yeah, so everyone, feel free to just jump in. If you'd prefer to use the raise hand feature, I'll try and keep an eye on that as well. I certainly have thoughts on this, but would love to open it up to the group before I jump in if anyone else, not to like call anyone out, but Aaron, I know you guys do a lot of work with kind of exploring this as it relates to kind of matching boards and nonprofits, and also have some programs, I think, that touch specifically on this. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts here.
Yeah, sure. Like with regard to kind of how we kind of connect to our stakeholder groups, or, like the work that we do in, DEI and board representation, or?
Yeah, I think both of those actually have interesting perspectives, if you wouldn't mind sharing.
Yeah. I mean, I think so. So at the heart, hi everyone, I'm Erin Pearson. I work for Cause Strategy Partners. We are a sort of a B corporation that helps to connect corporate leaders to opportunities to serve on nonprofit boards within their communities. So our work is really kind of, touches upon three primary stakeholder groups: sort of the corporate partners who are sponsoring this work, the nonprofits who are looking for, amazing, talented board members and often looking to diversify their board in meaningful ways, and then the candidates themselves who are opportunities. So through a lot of our work, we know huge, in terms of what we call authentic representation program. And we kind of work with our corporate partners and our nonprofit partners to really kind of not only like fill these roles, but also like kind of like ensure that the community is like, you know, adequately responding to what diversity means and how to support people in these roles too. So we've really kind of, you know, made DEI sort of a cornerstone of the work that we do, and it's kind of inalienable. You know, everyone is kind of going through a ton of, you know, DEI training, our nonprofit leaders and our candidates. Our corporate partners are like really, you know, invested in sponsoring this work and, you know, connecting us to their ERGs. But yeah, I don't know that we've like, you know, encountered a lot of friction in terms of like having folks, you know, bringing folks into this work in this way. But I think, yeah, like, I think a big part of it too, and what we do successfully is we actually like create, there is some meaningful segmentation. Like we don't just treat each audience or stakeholder group as a monolith. Like there's specifically separate programming that we do for BIPOC leaders because we know that their experience is different, and programming that we do for, you know, other types of, you know, identity groups as well. So I think the more you can kind of, you know, sort of seek to understand the experience of each stakeholder group and really kind of make sure that there's, you know, to the degree to which you're able to kind of customize things. I think that's been kind of a secret to success with sort of creating, you know, opportunities where folks feel supported. So.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, appreciate that, Erin. I think if anyone else has anything they'd like to add, please jump in or raise your hand. I think I can relate to this at some level, Julia, in that we've done, when in working with our clients, this is something that comes up a lot, not necessarily specifically phrased as belonging, but figuring out how to authentically communicate with essentially the supporters, the community. And I think one thing that's always an obvious solution, but one that's not often reached for, is just asking the community, right? Like actually going out and doing some user research instead of, you know, there's a time to kind of strategize and collaborate as a consultant and a client. And then there's also a time where you just have to go and test your ideas. So in a situation like that, where you might be getting some friction, it might be an interesting opportunity to go ask some stakeholders how they'd feel about that being a core pillar, or how they would feel about, you know, testing out some messaging and getting some real world input around whether or not that feels presumptuous. Because a lot of times people will have impressions or make assumptions or educated guesses around how things will be received in the community. And really, you don't ever know until you just actually release it and get feedback. And so, you know, coming from a lot of background and belief in design thinking, like one of the big elements of that is like early user testing, getting prototypes out there, whether that's a product or a strategy or messaging. So I'd encourage going out and actually, you know, not making too many assumptions around what will resonate, and getting some early feedback from the community before either greenlighting or shutting an idea down. And that's something that's been really helpful in our work for sure. Awesome. Anyone else want to add anything to this topic? I'm just checking chat here.
I guess I unmuted. I didn't check the chat yet, but this is awesome and super helpful. And I think I'm in the test. I'm so sorry, everyone, that I'm on my phone. Okay, great. I'm doing my best here. So I'm really interested. This is super helpful, and I'm interested in, like, I don't know what you all think, like, on a deeper level. Like, is it, because what I do is ethical. I coach and consult businesses, entrepreneurs, and orgs toward ethical marketing, which I define as it's based in a holistic enlistment into shared values rather than stoking fear and, you know, the FUD, stoking fear and scarcity. So I walk this line a lot. Like, what is ethical to promise? What is ethical to promise our stakeholders and those we serve, especially when it comes to belonging, safety, trauma sensitivity? I work with this with yoga teachers too. How can I promise that this room is going to be trauma sensitive? So we don't have to continue on this frame. I know we have a short frame, but I'm interested in you as well, like your personal beliefs. Really, like, where does that stand for you, and how do you walk that line? Like, what can I promise stakeholders? or suggest to our audiences that they're going to get from this experience. Especially, I work a lot with experiential marketing, so physical spaces, events, especially in a time where it feels scary to be out in the world, especially for people who have lived in a body that's been historically marginalized. So we don't have to continue on that frame, but that's really where I'm going. I know that could be another whole other discussion group, but yeah, that's really where my heart is. So thanks for listening.
Yeah, thank you. Super interesting stuff. And I think definitely relevant in general, but I think especially when you're talking about trauma-informed work in physical spaces more so than digital spaces. But I think it's interesting because I had another topic on the list for today that's been a trend I've been seeing a lot out there. I think especially related to some of the data around just like donations being down in general. And it's this topic that I'd love to hear everyone's perspective on. And really, I think the best way to summarize it is this kind of sense of urgency and kind of fear-based marketing that's been really prevalent in the last couple of years, especially in political campaigns. But I think that's starting to soak into just general social impact organizations as a fundraising strategy, and how that is kind of one side of the spectrum, is one that we advise heavily against with our clients. And then I'd say the other side of the spectrum is forging longer term authentic human connections with your supporters. And there's a whole spectrum, and sometimes you need to lean a little bit more urgent for certain campaigns or times a year or whatever it is. But I think we're starting to see that kind of the short term, that's really a short term game, that sense of urgency, and it can work, and that's why people do it. But I think it's starting to burn us all out. So there's this kind of cause fatigue, donor fatigue happening. And what we're seeing with our clients and just kind of observing the space is that people are still doing that. It's still prevalent, but a lot of people are starting to realize like this isn't going to be a long-term strategy, not even just for my organization, but it's kind of dragging the whole sector down as well. So I'm curious to see or to hear from the group if anyone else has been kind of keeping a pulse on that trend, or any experiences or examples that people would be open to sharing there, or just follow-up thoughts. Any takers? And if anyone has any other topics or questions they'd like to bring in, feel free also to just put it in the chat or raise your hand as well. Nick, I'm curious if this is something you've seen in your work. I know you do a lot of engagement analytics around campaigns.
Yeah, I mean, this might be an unpopular opinion and based on nothing other than gut, but I also don't necessarily believe that giving is actually down. I just think that the way that traditional giving is being measured is down. But there are so many different types of giving that are non-traditional that are being proliferated, and by different generations and by different platforms, that they're not being surveyed, that I think are way, I don't necessarily believe it. Yeah, there's some macroeconomic stuff that's happening, and like your guts, like the feeling is probably like it's down, but I don't necessarily, and anecdotally, I don't necessarily believe it. But that's just sort of a general, maybe a tinfoil hat sort of comment that I'll acknowledge isn't based on science or data. I just anecdotally don't necessarily believe that. But that also might feed into that fear narrative that you just sort of teed up, right? I think that like there is a lot of incentive to like who's putting this data together, and like what are the incentives for them to create that fear, right? Like I don't want to get too deep, but I think there's a lot of narrative in the impact space that is dated and is wrong. And it's changing so fast, and there's new stakeholder and new entrants that are participating in this space that traditionally have never been in it, that are disrupting it. And it's really mostly driven by two factors that I've seen. One is that obviously a younger generation is being much more involved, much more integrated in the conversation, in the movement, and in the momentum holistically in impact, which is driving massive change. Mm-hmm. But also we're seeing, I would fall into this, people that come from outside of the impact space that now are being driven into it because they are burnt out from their normal life and they want to do good, or whatever the many other things from a personal standpoint. So there's just so many different types of people coming into this space that are affecting all of these. So I think what you're describing and what you're seeing is kind of, there's a lot of traditional voices that are trying to get a grasp on how fast change is happening, that the whole fear narrative helps them do that because it's the tried and true playbook.
Yeah.
What, you know, I just finished writing a book kind of about this, and that more and more what I'm seeing successful from a long-term perspective is a true storytelling art, where you're really thinking about how do you communicate your mission and the impact that you're creating on a multi-tiered approach. It's no longer like, donate now, we're losing money and we need ROI now, and hey, we just spent $1,000, how much do we get back? That's sort of dying and is not going to work in the long term. What is going to work in the long term is how we're creating more engagement, or excuse me, more awareness with what we're actually creating, and what are those social, I call them social moments. What are those? How are we creating social moments to create more awareness about what we're doing and more engagement into what we're doing and our mission and building community around it. And social moments aren't just on social media. Like, we're real people that seek real connection. So like, how are we creating social moments around our mission and our community that brings people together? Because together we're much better than separated in you know, Zoom rooms, right? And then sort of once you're creating this awareness and engagement from a long-term perspective, then you can start figuring out how to drive awareness into action. And action can mean so many different things now. And so I don't know if that answers the question that you asked, but those are just sort of general feelings and thoughts that I'm seeing start to happen, and sort of just my personal, not even kaleidoscope, but perfect, which is my Nick Lynch personal opinion about what I'm seeing happen in the space at large.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. And maybe if there's time, we can even circle back to the first thread around, is giving even actually down? Because I know there's been a lot of controversy around that. Some of those statistics in the report that was released. Oh, Selah, I see your hand up. Go for it.
Yeah, so Nick, this is kind of jumping off of your answer to that question as sort of a follow-up, but also opening up to the rest of you. So I'm with an organization that's in the process of a website redesign and rebuild. And one of the things that we really need to focus on is our language. We work in a field that is pretty specific, and a lot of the terms that we use aren't necessarily familiar to all of the people that we're targeting as our donor base. And so my question is, with some of that distance, not only geographically, but also like just kind of like academically, there's just a lot of space, but like between what we do and where people are when they're coming to know us. And so what are some strategies that you guys have found to be effective in not only creating like kind of navigating the line between accessibility and accuracy when it comes to language, but also creating some of those social moments when there is such a distance often between the work that we're doing and our donors?
Eric, I think you have some good tidbits on this. I'm gonna say one thing and then I'll kick it to you. I call it the grandma test for anything that I do. If I can't explain what we do to my grandma in 3 sentences, then I got to go back to the drawing board and figure out how to best communicate it to my grandma. It's literally like for my whole life, and I've been in advertising technology for a long time. My family still doesn't know what I do, which is again, that's a personal problem. I can't necessarily figure out how to pass the grandma test. But when we work with our businesses and our partners, you're right. We're with a lot of organizations that have specific language and nuance and a whole lexicon that if you're in it, you totally get it. It's like, you know, you're surrounded by your people, you can talk the verbiage and the acronyms, but like outside of that community, you lose connection because they're like, I think I know what you do, but I don't quite know. So I follow the grandma test, but I'm sure Eric has a much more methodical and articulate way of communicating some process.
Oh man, that's hilarious. We actually once wrote an article about your theory of change, and if your grandma can't understand it, then it's not done. And then we got some backlash from an actual grandma who felt it was ageist, and I was like, oh God, what have we done here? So but yeah, totally in theory agree with that. I think there's so many different threads that this comes back to for me. So I think at the highest level, this really to me comes back to empathy and understanding your audience and understanding who the audience is in any piece of communication. So whether that's your website or a campaign, having clear definition of different segments of your audience, because almost all social impact organizations have a common problem of having many different disparate audiences that they need to reach and speak to, from everyday people who might be donors to more institutional donors to potential partners to potential staff. So there's this kind of need to tell an overarching brand story, but it's really difficult to tell one story that's going to be relevant to all of those different audience segments. So we spend a lot of time defining those audience segments in a practical way, not in a kind of silly way where you usually see personas and what, if you were a car, what kind of car would you be in, those kind of exercises, but just like clearly understanding like who are you trying to reach, how can you distill those down and understand kind of key messages and shared values and potential obstacles with all of those audiences. I think the other big mistake that a lot of organizations in general make, but especially social impact organizations, is that they think that their messaging needs to tell their story. And that's actually completely opposite. Like messaging needs to frame your supporter as kind of the main protagonist in the story. And so you need to tell a story about how they can get involved in helping you create an impact. And there's a place in your messaging and in your website to tell a story about your origin story and your founding story and a story about your team, and to get into some of the more nitty-gritty stuff around your theory of change and all of that. But that's not kind of the main story. That's a thread of the main story. And you really need the main story to be about how supporters can get involved in making a meaningful impact. And then impact storytelling around proof of impact, both emotionally and statistically, so that people get a sense that you're a credible organization that has a clear set of differentiation and unique strengths, so that I know I'm going to support you because I care about this thing and your organization stands out for these reasons. And then from there, you can get into some of these other threads as well. So I think it's really about flipping that whole approach and getting outside of the organization. And all of that is really important, thinking about those deeper, more academic elements to the work that you do. But if you lead there, people are going to gloss over and just get confused and bounce out. I see, Julia, you have a hand up. Go for it.
Yeah, you at the end there said a little bit of what I was thinking. And sorry to tease you, Nick, in the chat. I thought it was funny that said, I agree with you, Nick. And then my next one was, I disagree with you, Nick. Which is what this space is all about. But my client recently said, we need to be able to explain this to what we do to a 5-year-old. And I was like, why? No 5-year-olds are coming into this space. Like, I was like, no, we don't. This is the same client that was back. It's been an interesting go. So I was going to bring in a little bit more about what Eric said, but also ask about enough time that I'm really interested, Selah, in a little bit more detail, because just like Eric said, it's where there's so many places to tell certain parts of the story, and just really thoughtfully with a frame of like emotional intelligence. I'm really glad that Eric brought that in. And working, I don't know if you're the copywriter or what you're doing, but working with a copywriter and a strong, UI UX designer and consultant, which should not be confused with a copywriter, but we work together to be like, when will people read this? What does it feel like when they see this? What colors do we need so that it's not scary? How big is the font need to be so that they don't skim past it? But what if it's so big that it scares them? That kind of thing is so beautiful to think about. And I would really suggest going really slow with your organization and just getting into like, why does this work matter? Like Eric said, to us, but then how do people feel? How are they going to feel when they come into the fold of this community, and writing and designing toward that? It's a little vague, but that's the best I can say as someone who's worked with this kind of thing a lot. I'm also a science writer is one of my things. So I work with like this a lot, and it's tough. So good luck.
Aaron, go for it. You have your hand up.
Sure. I mean, mine kind of builds off of this because we definitely have the same challenge at, our organization. I always joke that we have way too many master's degrees than we're good for, because all of our writing feels that way too. And I have to just like constantly like take stuff and just dumb it down and explain to my staff why. I'm like, no, this is better writing. Like, we need to just communicate more fluently, easily. Like, so any thoughts on how to like coach that or like build that culture for your staff? Because that's something that's been sort of a continuous, I don't say challenge, but an opportunity, I think, for us to kind of lean into.
Anyone want to take a stab at it? I have thoughts, but do I see a hand up? No. I mean, I think for you, Aaron, knowing a little bit about cost strategy in your team, transparently, it really, I think, always comes back to empathy for me, and really understanding like who is the target audience of the messaging or the communication, and so that's one lens of it. And then it is also about accessibility and equity, because not everyone has a master's degree and is going to resonate with that level of writing. So I think it's about kind of right sizing the language complexity so that it doesn't feel fluffy and like overly distilled to a point that it's not actually meaningful or interesting or different. And so it may be that for you guys, particular pieces that are more for, let's say, board candidates or folks that may have different levels of academic literacy, maybe those pieces are a little bit more conversational in nature, a little bit simpler, a little bit more distilled. And then for potential partners or potential, other kind of folks in the sector, you can kind of lean into more of the academic framing language, get a little bit more nuanced with it. So I think it really does depend on who the piece is for at the end of the day. It gets hard if it's kind of for a couple different audiences at a couple different levels. So that's, always how we kind of think about stuff. And then I think sometimes it's also about, and I think you guys are actually really good at this from what I see on the sidelines, translating, right? Like, so letting someone write in their natural way, because getting people to write at all can be difficult, especially if they're not full-time copywriters, and then helping to either coach or translate for them. And I know that can be difficult because then people are like, you're dumbing my ideas down, or this isn't what I said. But I think really just kind of coming back to like having empathy for the end user and who the piece is actually for, and even kind of bringing up some of the elements around accessibility and equity can hopefully help people understand that even if it's not how they would think about it or write it, that it's going to actually be more effective as a piece of communication for the organization.
Yeah, that's super helpful, kind of particularly the accessibility and equity piece. I think that'll resonate. Yeah,
I think also, Jules, you mentioned in the chat, especially for like multilingual organizations that have audiences, is something we've run into a lot. And yeah, it can be even harder to translate really dense academic content in a multilingual setting. So that also can kind of come into play as well. Great. Awesome. Super appreciate
Aaron,
the
discussion.
Julia, Nick, and Eric, thank you guys all. Those are super helpful answers.
Yeah, no worries, Sayla. Great. Any other topics from the group, questions, things that you'd like to bring up? I have others I can bring into the mix as well. I would actually be interested to kind of circle back to Nick's topic around, is giving actually down? Because I think that one has a number of different threads we can get into. So maybe we'll go there. And then if that inspires anything else, just let us know. Nick, you kind of alluded to this, but we are in this weird macroeconomic world right now that seems kind of jittery and uncertain. And I think that we are starting to see kind of like emotional obstruction there in terms of people not feeling like they have the means to give. Or I do think some of the kind of like cause burnout, and just burnout in general is part of that as well. I mean, I know like for me specifically, like I've unsubscribed from more organizations that I care deeply about in the last year than I have before, just because the noise is getting so noisy, and the approach to marketing has been driven more and more into this urgency-based work. Some of the key organizations that I really support and continue to subscribe to do a really good job of doing a better balance of, we kind of have this general guideline of like two gives for every ask, where you're providing value, if that's education or updates. I think a lot of times social impact organizations are experts in their field, whatever their focus area might be. And one of the biggest pieces of value they can provide to their subscribers or to their audience is education around like what's happening in the space, because you have your finger on the pulse as a social impact organization around your area of expertise. And when I follow organizations against any particular cause area, I'm not as informed around what's happening. What are the wins? What are the obstructions or the barriers right now? You know, what should I care about? And so when organizations can educate me on those things, that's super valuable for me, and makes me want to give, makes me want to continue to support and listen to the organization. So yeah, in terms of I think giving is changing though, in terms of how people are giving either time or money, how much, you know, relationships with organizations. So if anyone would like to expand on that with, you know, experiences or trends that they're seeing, or Nick, if you wanted to kind of revisit that topic, I think that's a super interesting one.
Yeah, I mean, just generally speaking, I mean, you know, corporations are increasing how much they match up to now, right? I mean, they're definitely providing more dollars directly to organizations. It has to now be part of most corporate ethos in terms of, you know, to attract talent. Again, mostly younger talent, but you know, so I mean, and also there's a lot of things around just direct giving, like people are just sending money through Zelle and all the other ones. I'm totally blanking, but like it's just all, it's like a lot of more direct donations directly to people or even small causes. And so it's just, to me, I mean, I think you kind of nailed it. Like there seems to be this like, and I don't know what conference all of these marketers went to, but it's like there's just a homogenized like tactics of saying the same kinds of things around, whether it's urgency or whether it's a kind of about their mission. It's very sort of patterned and formulaic.
Yeah.
You're right. I love the 2-for-1 sort of idea where you give 2 valuable for 1, you know, 2 gifts for 1 ask. I think that's brilliant. And yeah, I mean, you're talking kind of about transparency, like people who are really deeply passionate about what you do want to know about the people that are actually behind the scenes driving the mission, and what drives them. What are the things that are happening internally that are important to you, that maybe you're challenged or struggle with it, that you may actually want to ask your community for support with? What is the biggest win over the last month, right? Like those are things that maybe you would think corporate culture is really good at, because that sort of drives so that rah stuff internally. But like as followers of missions and organizations, like we want to know that stuff too, and we also want to share that stuff. I mean, I don't really care about calling this out because I'm a diehard for them, but I think you know this, Eric. I'm a Wish kid. I'm a former Wish kid. I was granted a Wish when I was 3 when I was sick. There's not one thing that Make-A-Wish would ask me that I would say no to. But what you're talking about, I have been seeing extensively over the last year and some change, where the emails that I get from them on a regular basis are less about the amazing wishes that these kids come up with, because creativity is a big part of this.
Yeah.
And I mean, I've seen some of the most creative wishes thought of and fulfilled, and those stories to me are the ones that win every single time. But it's almost the opposite ratio of what you just described, where I'll get 3 asks before I get a give, where it's like, actually, I want to know about what just happened with this family, or I want to hear. They don't do a great job of it, but like I want to hear the stories of the people who are Wish kids, who like are now, they're not 6 anymore, they're 16, or they're not 8 anymore, they're 28, or they're not 3 anymore, they're almost 40, like this guy. Like I want to know more about those things than, hey, we're down 50% year, whatever it is, or you know, act now when we'll quadruple your done. Like none of that stuff makes me want to give at all. So yeah, I think it's just like the tone of everything also makes the feeling of it not. Yeah.
It is. Yeah. It's a bit of a mystery to me, because we've never worked with a client or advised a client on that approach. So I can't speak to whether or not it's effective. It must be at some level in theory, or we wouldn't see it be so prolific. But I think that it's it's a short game is the way I always think about it. It may lead to a short-term surge in donations, but I think if you look over a longer term trajectory, you'll see that those, are leading to more unsubscribes, lower engagement over time, because you're essentially wrecking a relationship with a human when you do that at the end of the day. And that's what really powers things. Yeah, Karen, go for it.
You were just talking about not necessarily having seen that. And there's one industry that I see it work so successfully constantly, and that's animal rescue.
Yeah, that's
so
true.
I follow them on social media, and it's like they show the cute little happy animals at the sanctuary, and you're like, oh, that's so nice. And then they showed like this sad, like almost dead, like we rescued, like, and it is that kind of thing where it's like, oh, like it tugs on your heartstrings. It is technically in a way that fear-based, but it also is like, I think, it comes down to balancing fear and hope, and seeing what your audience resonates with. And but yeah, I definitely, I know there's exceptions to every rule, and I don't think that necessarily applies to every industry and every style of nonprofit, but I think that is one. They have it like their marketing just like built in those kind of situations, and that's when you see, because you can see the tally on social media, like how much has been raised and everything else. But
and I think
that in there.
And that's a situation where there actually is a true sense of urgency, like, and by the day, like if we don't find a home for this puppy, like it will be put down, right? Like I think I think it's also about, it's not necessarily the case that you can't ever be urgent or express urgency, but it's a, Boy Who Cried Wolf story. If everything's always urgent all the time, then by definition, nothing's ever truly urgent. So I think if you are running these campaigns as an organization, you're kind of, you're not really effectively able to truly communicate urgency when it's authentic, if you're saying everything's always urgent all the time. Yeah, Sayla, go ahead.
Yeah, I really like using the framework of information versus formation. And obviously not that one is necessarily absent of information, but I think it's really helpful for me when I see storytelling that really focuses on forming this broader narrative across multiple interactions, because again, it's respecting your audience and it's respecting your organization through this, this genuine engagement of like, we are both humans, like, at the end of the day, like it all boils down to this, and we form this narrative together instead of just, we're gonna match your gift times 7, like here's all the information you need to know. I think it just, again, it's an empathy driven way of building that narrative that really is compelling to me, and I think many others.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the other example that's very common is like donation drives, like NPR comes to mind, where NPR does a great job of giving all year long and asking very aggressively for a very short amount of time. And I think that even that can be annoying as a listener and a supporter. I'm an NPR supporter. We underwrite NPR also, but and believe strongly in their mission. And even that, as annoying as it is as a listener, like it doesn't annoy me as deeply, because they provide so much value throughout the rest of the year. And I know how critical it is to their funding. And so I think I think at the end of the day, it always comes back to me around being authentic to truth and honesty in your marketing around, like, is this actually urgent? Why is it urgent? And making sure that if you do run urgent campaigns like that, that it's based in truth and that it's not overutilized. Another kind of really important topic around urgency is climate and urgency, because climate is an actual urgent, existential threat. And we've done a lot of work with climate-based organizations. And there's a lot of discussion in that space around urgency and overutilization of that as a tactic for support and for partnership and for funding. Because although it is urgent, again, if it's always urgent all the time, even though it actually truly is an urgent global issue, it still doesn't work long-term for support, because if you're constantly bombarding people with messages of, fear and urgency and disaster, as humans, we can only take so much of that before we start to just become numb to it and just kind of check out and become apathetic. And so we did a climate-based campaign in California, and we flipped that completely on its head. And we instead kind of leaned into a brand strategy of really like wanting to tap back into like nostalgic good vibes California as the message, as the approach, as the aesthetic for the brand. And, you know, I can't A/B test if that was more effective than the urgent approach for that campaign, but I know we got a lot of really good feedback from supporters around how refreshing it was to hear and experience and support a climate campaign that wasn't based on disaster. So I think there's been a lot of true disaster in the world in the last 3 years and continue to be disaster in the world and urgent issues. And I think that's part of what's creating some of this fatigue around these causes, because it's more than any of us as one individual human can hold. So I think really leaning into progress, solutions, technology, especially around climate or some of these other issues, and really giving people something to be inspired by and to have hope for, and to show that there's a way to address these issues, even if they are serious and terrible and urgent. That's really, I think, a better long-term strategy overall. Looking at the time, we've got about 5 minutes left before we're scheduled to wrap up. Anyone we haven't heard from who would like to chime in before we do?
This is Carter. I think I'll just chime in. Thanks again for hosting, Eric. I didn't know who would show up, but it feels like we slant towards agencies or consultants that help nonprofits. I have just moved back to the States from Rwanda, and they're actually actively trying to get giving and donations to go down in Rwanda because they want their own people and they want business to solve more of the problems. And so it's a very, very different context. But I'm really encouraged as an American who just moved back to America that purpose impact has taken root among more businesses, the Patagonia types, and the agencies that serve those businesses. And so I'd love to hear from anybody that has seen that trend, because I feel like that's a profound and important and powerful step forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I could speak to that briefly and encourage anyone else to. It's something that I've definitely noticed as we essentially repositioned to focus only on social impact around 2016, 2017.
Okay.
And since then, and this is maybe a confirmation bias situation here, but I just feel like every day I see more and more agencies, consultants, people kind of transitioning out of corporate world into the impact world. And I think that's great. It's a good trend. And I think it's one that's rooted in a lot of things. And I think I invite everyone to kind of think about how that can work in their lives. And it's not for everyone, right? Like, and I think that there is still a place for organizations to just do really good, honest work that's not for social impact. We still need folks to make really awesome espresso machines in a sustainable way, right? And they don't need to have a political stance on every issue that's out there. And at the same time, I think in general, people are looking for purpose in their lives, and a big part of our lives is our work and what we do every day. And I think if we can really continue to support that trend of people fighting for purpose and for an ethical approach to all of the work that we do in the world, that's only going to help kind of lift everything up.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I always say it's never been a better time to be an impact-driven organization. The amount of available and diversified partnerships has never been greater. The access to tools and technology at low or no cost has never been greater. And so, yeah, I mean, what a time, because it may feel really hard and like on the operational stuff. I mean, there's so much transition that's happening so fast. The pandemic just put it into overdrive for everybody, especially impact-driven organizations. So I think from a molecular level, it's very, very hard. But if we're at all able to take a breath and like look back, like take a step back and go, wow, I think that will help provide some gratitude, because I'm literally like, there's never been a better time. I feel there's never been a better time.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like that's a great place to end for today. Thank you all for coming. This started as just a really informal experiment, and it was a lot of fun. So I hope you guys all had a good time. I'll do a bit of a follow-up kind of takeaway article that we'll post on our site, and I'll share that with the group. And definitely open to hosting these again at some kind of regular interval, whether that's quarterly or monthly, just kind of depending. And so if you guys want to share any feedback around how this went or other topics, definitely open to that. I have thought about maybe trying to, if we do continue this, have a little bit more of a specific theme for each meeting, so that there's, you know, a sense of whether or not it's a good fit for you to join each one. But really just wanted to have a place to kind of just chat and talk shop. I think we all get really focused on our daily work, and it's great to be able to connect, especially across multiple countries and time zones. And so as much as doing stuff in the real world and in person is always amazing, like the opportunity that the digital and virtual space opens up is also really cool. So thank you all for participating and joining, and I'll keep you posted on whether or not we're going to host another one.
Thank you, Eric.
Thanks
Thanks.
all. Good to see you.
Thank you all for your input. Thanks for hosting, Eric. Bye.
Bye.